So when I saw this article today, um, it was all I could do to stop making horrible loud noises because uh, this is painful. The gentleman who wrote this has a doctorate in the philosophy of language, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But uh, this piece is just the epitome of the vapid uselessness of higher education in America at this point, where it doesn't matter what words actually mean. You just can use them in any way you feel like in order to try to transfer your feelings over to somebody else. So essentially, this gent here is uh, praising what Biden said to a certain extent, but also actually saying he didn't go far enough. And at the same time, saying that Republicans have no particular reason to feel a need for an apology because everything he's saying is correct. Oh, how convenient. So I won't be picking this apart point by point because there's sections of it which are just kind of painful in their own little way. Uh, but essentially, as I said, he gets into this thing. He starts talking about semi fascism and fascism, and then says, hey, the Republicans are getting upset, but there's nothing Biden needs to apologize for because uh, essentially what he said is correct. Uh, and then he says, however, in painting MAGA Republicans as essentially intruders into American politics, the president did misrepresent our history. Biden is correct that equality and liberty are fundamental values of democracy. No nation that denies these benefits can be a democracy. Okay, so this is where this is going to sound like a nitpick, but I think it sets up the article where he can use words and have no tie whatsoever to their meaning and just say, well, here's a word. Now I'm going to define it any way I damn well please. Okay, so he's saying that if you don't have equality and liberty, they are the fundamentals of democracy. You're not a nation that's democratic. Okay, have you heard of a place called Athens? Essentially the city state of Athens during ancient Greek times. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, you may have heard of it. Each household had about 3 to 4 slaves. Hmm. So we also could mention that the Indian republics, and we use the term kind of loosely because that's the term Alexander applied to them, but of the names Sangus and Gainus. Uh, both these republics had a monarch, elected assemblies, and all free men could vote and attend these assemblies. Democracy, but I can guarantee you they probably didn't have equality and liberty. And then we have the Ibadites of Oman, uh, traditionally chose their leader via community-wide elections of qualified candidates. Starting as far back as the 8th century, they were distinguished early on in the region by their belief that a ruler needed the consent of the ruled. Hmm, democratic. This leader ended up being both religious and secular leader of the area. So, knowing the area, uh, essentially the religious rule was all encompassing because everything was devolved from the religious texts. So there wouldn't be a whole lot in what we would probably consider liberty there. Maybe it had more liberty than it did in the past, but it sure wouldn't measure up to standards of liberty, even for the Roman Republic, probably. Yet we're all talking about democracies here. Yet this guy here and let's name him for fun, Jason Stanley, is saying that you can't have a democracy without equality and liberty. So he's just basically taking words and just doing whatever he wants to them. So we'll see more of that as we roll along. So he starts talking about the idea of semi-fascism or fascism. And once again, here he's abusing the term fascism. I talked about this in a previous video, designating the differences between fascism, Nazism, and socialism. And I know people will say, "Oh, that's kind of nitpicking." Well, it's not, because the problem is people have deliberately mislabeled fascism, Nazism, and socialism since World War II because of the very awkward problem if you ended up with two socialist states, the National Socialist Worker Party of Germany and the Communist Party, or the Union of Soviet Socialist States, going up against each other in World War II, and people wanted to divorce the word socialism from the Nazis as quickly as possible. So the term fascist got adopted, and apologists have used it ever since. So several things to understand between the difference between fascism and Nazism. The two areas where they agreed were they were both socialist. They both called themselves socialists. They both implemented socialist policies. Where they differed is both of them believed that Marx was wrong in terms of where struggle occurred. Marx believed struggle occurred between the classes, and in order to get to his perfect socialist government, and then later on communist government, required a war between the classes in which essentially no classes existed when it was done. Essentially, fascism and Nazism wanted to get to a perfect form of socialism as well. Fascism was the Italian model, and instead of class warfare, they believe in nationalistic warfare. That in order to overcome what was going on in the country, in order to bring about a perfect socialism, there needed to be a perfect all-encompassing nationalism where everyone firmly agreed with the idea of being Italian. Nazism is different in that they believed in racial struggle. They created a fake system of races with Aryans at the top and Jews at the bottom, and they believed that the class struggle was between the races, and the only way socialism could ever be implemented was through violent racial warfare until one race stood above the others. So, another important thing to remember is the fascists and Nazis were initially at odds with each other. They believed their systems to be so horribly incompatible that the two of them were vying for dominance over Europe and nearly went to war over the government being overthrown in Austria. Essentially, the Germans were forced to stand down in order to avoid a war, which they could not ill afford to do at the time. The only point which the Italians joined up with the Germans is as France was falling, the Italians were fearful that if they didn't jump in, they were going to miss their share of the spoils. A huge difference, for instance, if we look at Italy, there were no oppressed groups by race. In fact, in Italy, Jews actually made up a predominantly large part of the fascist party. And even after the Germans and Italians allied, Mussolini refused to persecute the Jews the same way the Germans were. The only time the Jews eventually became persecuted was after the Italian government overthrew Mussolini, essentially capitulated to the Allies, and then the Germans forcefully reinstated a new version of the Italian social state under Mussolini in North Italy. Under absolute German occupation was the only time the Italians joined in with the idea of rounding up people by race. So this, so the reason why fascism and Nazism are equated, because the word Nazi, or the acronym Nazi, has socialism in its name. So therefore, it's a really awkward thing to have in there if you're pro-socialist. Fascist doesn't have it in the name, so therefore it's a little sexier to use and it doesn't evoke socialism. So therefore, writers of the time, starting with Russia, adopted the term fascism in order to cover up socialism, and essentially sympathetic writers in the West followed suit. Now the question comes down to, does our good doctor who wrote this know that? Was this taught to him incorrectly and he just doesn't know the difference between a Nazi, a fascist, and a socialist? We'll delve into that a bit. All right. So, starting in here, a fascist, socialist, and political movement revolves around a cultish leader who employs lies and propaganda to foment humiliation and fear of the other. Liberals, Marxists, feminists, immigrants, and minorities. At the core of the fascist propaganda is the threat of replacement, that the dominant group will be replaced culturally and physically by minorities and their values. The fascist leader represents democratic procedures themselves as the source of this replacement and urges political violence both as a threat and solution. Okay, so because essentially what he's trying to do, he's playing this game where he's going, look at the fascists, look at the Nazis, look at Trump. And he's kind of mixing together, and he's doing this so quick that you are having trouble figuring out exactly what he's talking about. So, who were the replacements that Mussolini was using to fearmonger his people with? Because he believed every single person born within the borders was an Italian, therefore part of the nation. He didn't persecute people based on, because there were actually at least two major ethnic groups within Italy, if not many, because Italy had been cobbled together out of numerous countries. It had only been a country since around 1850, 1860 time frame. So who were these others that Mussolini was scaring his people with? Maybe Marxists. Okay. Hitler definitely fearmongered via the Jews. But the idea that they were replacements is ludicrous beyond all belief. Okay? It's not like Jews were flooding into the nation of Germany, especially as more and more of the Nazi ideas became known to people. In fact, they were trying to leave, not come. So how could they possibly become replacements? How were they going to overwhelm Germany with their numbers? Essentially, to understand the German view of what Jews represented in their corrupt and false race theory was the idea that Aryans created nation states, and only Aryans could. And essentially that Jewish people were a parasite people that can only exist in other people's nation states. And essentially, the greatness of a nation state was measured by how Aryan it was, and as it came down to its collapse, it was based on how less Aryan it was. So the idea that Hitler was espousing replacement theory, or Mussolini was espousing replacement theory, is bonkers. This guy is literally making shit up. He has no idea what the history of these countries are, or if he does, he's lying, because he has to, if his PhD has any basis, in his claim that he's an expert on fascism, he's got to know this. So he's just making stuff up. He's saying what he wants his audience to hear. He's not trying to enlighten us about something that's real. Okay, what about the others, the liberals, the Marxists, the feminists, the immigrants, the minorities? These would be the same Marxists who tried to overthrow both the governments of Italy and Germany. So, to give them their due, they did have a little bit of something to fear of. In fascist Italy, the Marxists attempted to take over, and essentially the Italian establishment pretty much gave the country over to Mussolini and said, do whatever you want as long as these idiot Marxists don't become in charge. The Marxists in Germany succeeded in taking over some of the provinces and were put down fairly quickly. And they were the first ones to resort to violence. Their predecessor, Army in the Street, was Antifa. Antifa precedes the brown shirts of the Nazi Party. They were there first. They were causing the violence. So the idea that the Marxists wouldn't eventually receive the brunt of violence in the end since they initiated it, it seems kind of weird that he's choosing them as people he needs to defend. These are the same Marxists who now march in our street under the guise of Antifa, destroying, looting, assaulting, and murdering citizens. I haven't heard people calling for violence against Antifa, including Trump and Trump supporters. I'll just not say anything more on that. But I think Antifa has a lot more coming to it than it's got so far. Okay, feminists. What in the bloody hell is he even trying to say here? How is he trying to other feminists? Which wave of feminism? The first wave, the second wave, the third wave, the fourth wave? I bet you they could get along with the first and second wave feminists without any problems whatsoever. They'd probably have some ideological differences between the third and huge ones with the fourth. But are they advocating violence against women because they're feminists? I haven't heard it. Sounds like BS to me. Okay, what about immigrants? Well, there's something kind of odd going on here because he seems to be oblivious to the fact that we have a border crisis. We have a non-functional immigration system. It clearly doesn't work right. Essentially, it is a contrived system where, on one hand, politicians want to make it appear like we do have an immigration system, while at the same time they want it to be as porous as possible in order to benefit supporters who want people coming in over the border. Pointing out that we have a messed up border system is not anti-immigrant. We need to come up with a system that works and works the way Americans want it to, not special interests in America. And if he's trying to refer to immigrants to Germany or Italy during that time period, again, no idea what he's talking about. Trying to draw parallels between the two make no sense at all. And I mean, if you look online, you can find plenty of minorities that are drawn to Trumpism. Minorities that are Republicans, minorities that are conservatives, minorities that are libertarians. Now, interestingly enough, absolutely regardless of what the person looks like, what their ethnicity is, what their ancestry is, suddenly they cease to be the person they appear to the left if they change their mind from the majority of their minority. You don't see people on Trump's side saying, if you don't believe this way, you ain't black. And they don't say, if you don't believe this way, you ain't white. a left thing. So I have no idea what he's even trying to say here. Um, yeah, bonkers. Okay, so he says we can think of a semi-fascist regime as one that approaches fascism while retaining some trappings of democracy. An essentially fascist regime that keeps a powerless opposition party around for the sake of show, for example, or a one-party state that falls short of a full dictatorship. Again, what on earth is he even babbling about? What words are coming out of his his keyboard that he's even trying to make a thought around? What does this mean? This isn't a one. Okay, now from my libertarian standpoint, we tend to look at this as a duopoly where both parties are representing the interest of the establishment. But the idea that there's a single party here ruling this country hasn't been true, with the exception of a brief period after Andrew Jackson up through the 10 years before the Civil War. So what on earth is he saying? What is he trying to say? Don't know. So is the ANC in Africa a semi-fascist state? The ANC in South Africa has been in charge since 1994, and no other party, although they exist, can get a foothold in the parliament in order to represent different interests in the country. Is he referring to the UNMO of Malaysia, which has been in power since 1957? There are other parties there. They just can't gain traction and get in. Was the Swedish Social Democrat Party semi-fascist because they ruled from 1936 to 1970 with no other people sharing government? Was the PRI in Mexico a semi-fascist party when they ruled from 1929 to 2000 with nobody else in there? Again, what is he saying? If somehow he's saying that applies to this country, he's completely out of his mind. Or if he believes that, he's completely out of his mind. Because the more you read this, the less I believe that he believes what he's writing. Okay. So, where are we here? So, he says, the U.S. has already harbored a semi-fascist regime in its territory, which had a substantial impact on the development of Europe's most famous explicitly fascist movements, including German Nazism. The regime was called Jim Crow, and it lasted from the end of Reconstruction in the mid-1870s until the Civil Rights Movement of the mid-1960s. That's pretty weird. And there's an element there of something I can agree with, but I'll get to that. Okay, so let's say I use the word fascist the way he does. Wouldn't the period of slavery be just a little more fascist than the post-slavery period? Now, if you look at the entire period encompassed by Jim Crow, there was a slow general improvement for all minorities, Jews, Asians, blacks, and Hispanics. Yes, the improvement period was slow, it was glacial, it was horrible, it should have happened faster, but it was happening. Now, if you look at Germany, things just continuously got worse for the Jews. They didn't slowly improve over time. So, what is fascism something that can just kind of lose its grip due to the electoral process, the change in minds of people? I thought fascism just had absolute control over everything. So how did the Jim Crow fascism period slip out of their little greasy fingers? We don't know. He's not going to tell us because I don't think he does know. Now, interestingly enough, he does tip his hand here a bit, and I do agree with him slightly on something. Jim Crow was accepted by the establishment. And I agree, because I believe in the establishment theory of how things run in a country. So therefore, if he wants to lay all of Jim Crow on the establishment, I will agree with him. If he's trying to point it at a particular party, not so much, because it takes two parties to make it work. Because it wasn't like a period of total Republican control, nor a period of total Democratic control. In periods of Republican control, they did not move to remove Jim Crow. And at the same time, obviously the Democrats didn't either. Now, interestingly, and this kind of goes back to one of my other videos when I was talking about originalism. Essentially, the Jim Crow concept was kept in place by the people who interpret the Constitution as a living document. Essentially, Jim Crow would have been rejected by originalists, because the living document people essentially look at what is generally popular, what is generally accepted, and says, this is the law of the land. Whereas the originalists look at the exact wording, look at the intention of the people who draft it, and say, this is how it must be. The 1960s definitely saw an improvement of the equality of the laws, but it also marked the high water mark of Black economic achievement. From that point on, essentially from the end of Civil War to 1960, the Black American family's financial success was on a meteoric rise. In fact, in the last, from 1940 to 1960, all indicators were that it was eventually going to hit parity with white families. And then processes of the 1960s ended that. So now there's some stuff here. Let's see. This guy, I'll just read through this real quick. Jim Crow was a legal and extra-legal regime that enforced white supremacy by denying Black Americans in the South access to the polls, as well as educational and vocational opportunities. Blah, blah, blah. Hitler's American model. Whitman documents in detail how Nazi legal theorists used Jim Crow as a model for their own citizenship laws, restricting full citizenship to Aryan blood, etc., going on down. Now, I don't disagree with this paragraph to the most part, because this is a known fact. The Nazis did look at the American South as their initial template. However, the idea to say that it's an absolute parallel, again, doesn't make any sense, because the worst days of Jim Crow don't come anywhere close to the worst days of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. Yes, the template was borrowed, but the two can't be compared that closely. Okay, so he says, thus, MAGA Republicans is not alien to the U.S., it is a descendant of Jim Crow. Step 1, steal underpants. Step 3, profit. That doesn't make sense, does it? Nor does what he says. He does not he does not show this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, therefore it doesn't exist. He just is making an assertion with absolutely nothing to back it up. There are minorities who are conservative, libertarian, Republican, Trump supporting, even MAGA supporters. It is the left that strips them of their personhood for wrongthink. They're the ones who see minorities as the racial groups. Okay. So. And its leaders are bringing back the same tactics of voter suppression, attacks on history and education, and calls for political violence, using the specter of black political protest as an existential threat to white America. As with fascist movements in the past, it is harshly anti-LGBTQ and anti-feminist, presenting LGBTQ Americans and abortion rights as threats to traditional values. Boy, that's a lot to unpack. So, requiring someone to have a picture ID is not suppression. It's barely an inconvenience. And pretty much all the places that require voter ID will allow provisional ballots to be issued under fairly liberal ideas. So, nonsense. Sorry. Uh, Overall, here I see what appears to be leftist mirroring. It's the leftist tactic we've seen over the last 10 years where they do something and then they go, oh, you did it. This thing that we did, we're not even going to acknowledge we did it. We're just going to point at you and blame you and say you did it. So he talks about attacks on history, yet he ignores the fact that we're attempting to rewrite all of our history using CRT dynamics. The idea that people are permanently lesser people because of the color of their skin. That's history worth fighting against. And then we're talking about calls for political violence versus actual political violence. So, January 6th crap. Okay, if somebody assaulted somebody on January 6th at the Capitol, if somebody trespassed, if somebody did property damage, if somebody stole something, they need to be punished in accordance with the law with due process. Period. Nothing to it. But these same people freaking out saying calls for political violence have been supporting actual political violence, where Black Lives Matter, infiltrated by Antifa, have been basically tearing up the streets of major cities. Now, if you look at these BLM protests and you're like, ooh, you're against black people. I don't know. Everyone I see is full of white people. I see skinny white lefties basically dominating these groups that are destroying things. I see more of them on the streets than blacks. And it's not an existential threat to white America that's the problem. It's a threat to black Americans trying to work their way out of the lower class because these jackasses in Antifa and BLM are destroying black property. And in all honesty, if you took LGP and separated it from the QT, you probably wouldn't hear 90% of what you think is actually happening. It's a very deliberate attempt of the left to lump things together that don't belong together so that any criticism of any part of it, it can be transformed into an attack on the whole. Now, ultimately, if you want to talk about racism in America, Jim Crow in America, unequal laws and the various things that have happened in our history, and I do think need to be talked about, and they do need to be talked about in our schools, this isn't fascism. It's progressivism. Yes, it is. Progressives very much wanted to create a dominant Anglo-Protestant descended class. The initial progressives came from Protestant roots, were no longer believers, but still believed that the class of Protestants were the ones who should be running things. They're the ones who created widespread abortion for the primary purpose of getting rid of black people and other people they consider to be the underclass. The progressives are the ones who put the laws in place to try to keep the Irish Catholics down and keep the German Catholics down and keep other Eastern Europeans from being able to gain power. The progressive movement has learned daintier language over it. But in the end, they're still the same people they've always been. They know who they want in their place. It's no accident that the same Great Society laws passed by Lyndon Baines Jackass Johnson were progressive plans, and that these probably had more to do with stopping the advancement of black family financial progress than anything else in the world. Patrick Moynihan warned them that was going to happen. So ultimately, we have to ask, who is this guy and what was he doing? We have Jason Stanley. He essentially has his PhD studies in the philosophy of words and propaganda. Okay, he did write a book on fascism, but that's not his dominant study. So if he is an expert, if his PhD, his thesis, the people he trained under, taught him about philosophical word use and propaganda, why isn't he writing an article on propaganda? I mean, one would assume that in the Trumpian sphere, there's probably some fantastic propaganda to pick apart and analyze. And you could probably lay down some pretty solid points in that favor. But I think the answer's staring us clear in the face. No, he's not an expert in fascism. He's an expert in propaganda. And that's what this is. Propaganda. Hope you found that interesting. A little on the ranty side, but it is kind of a pet peeve, this whole taking words and just making them whatever the hell you want them to be. So I hope you like this. If you did, like. If you have comments on it, please do comment. I will likely answer your comments. I might even make a video about them, depending on what's going on with them, if it's something you're asking that's pretty in-depth. If you think there's somebody who might enjoy this, share this with them. And if you like this, you might like other things I do. Check my other videos out. Subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much for spending time with me. Hope to see you again in a future video.